Hi everyone, I'm Mark Fox, CEO of NetEvents, and delighted to welcome all the press from around the world to this event today on market opportunities for 5G, IoT, and edge compute. Really hot area right now. I'm delighted to introduce Caron, who is Global Head of Research and Analysis for the Technology Group at GlobalData. Jerry, over to you to introduce and chair your session.
Thanks very much, Mark, and hello, everybody. Very pleased to have an opportunity once again to work with the NetEvents team to have a really good and important conversation about some key issues in the industry. As Mark noted, I'm the head of research for the technology group within GlobalData, but what's interesting is GlobalData actually has intelligence services in 20 different vertical industries now, tech and telecom being one. So that gives me and my team, our team, a great opportunity to learn about what specific industries, such as retail or pharmaceuticals or healthcare, whatever, what they need in terms of technology and how it affects their strategy, which in turn is very important to our conversation today. I'm going to be joined on a panel in a little bit by Mikael, Bäck, Saratendu, Sethi, Terence, McCabe, Shamik, Basu, and Stephen Spellicy. And we're going to have a conversation about these issues, where the market is, what's happening, and what's going to be we can expect in the future. They'll introduce themselves in a minute, but first, if we can move on to the next slide, I wanted to sort of set the table and mention a few top level thoughts. Moving to the next slide, please. So what we're talking about here in terms of concepts of like IoT as a market opportunity, and the edge computing and 5G really are all interrelated. Some things like IoT have been around for a very long time and are indeed enabled by existing technologies, whether they be fixed network technologies or various low power network technologies, et cetera. This is in place and has been moving along, but there are a number of different elements coming into play on the network side and also on the compute side, as well as in analytics and AI, that are coming together to form something different. Like I said, some of this has been around for a while, like IoT, but it's complemented by new solutions such as 5G network services and edge computing capabilities, and they're together driving a concept of an even more highly automated, cleaner, safer, and generally more productive industrial world or business world. That's the idea that we're moving toward, and this has traction with businesses worldwide. And so, for the past several years, particularly around 5G enterprise deployments, we've been told and by the technology developers and suppliers, by the service providers, by really the entire ecosystem, that yes, this next generation of mobile networking will make things that we do today better, but most importantly, it'll enable things that we haven't yet imagined. And so we've been asked to use our imagination. Again, IoT has been around for years, and indeed AI has been around for many years. Machine learning, analytics, and all sorts of many forms of automation. But the question is, are we at the cusp of something faster, something more real time, more embedded in all business processes? So that's sort of what we're looking at. And at GlobalData, we sort of look at all of these interrelated technologies, and it helps drive our research agenda. Just quickly, let me dive into two things I'll mention quickly before we get to the panel discussion. Next slide, please. So about this idea of 5G, it's been around for quite some time now. It's been the standards, the original standards for transitioning from 4G to 5G have been around for some time, but we still have the sense we're waiting. Well, we did have a bit of a pause in most regions of the world, but we're seeing things catch up. There are more There's more work on the next standards that are required. There are more auctions around the world for spectrum. We're seeing lots of different service rollouts and alliances take place. So there's been a lot of activity picking up in 2021 so far. Some of it is involved, around what are these enterprise 5G services, what do they need to look like? And the focus there is on, making sure it supports application priority and guaranteed bandwidth. There's this concept of slicing, and all of this is still taking shape, but we're seeing work toward that taking place and examples of use cases taking shape as well. Like I said, a lot of standards work. The next standard from the 3GPP that'll come out, I think it's going to be called 5G Advanced. I think that's been approved, to sort of take it to the next level, take it to that place where the magic of 5G that we've been talking about for 4 years or so now will really be in place in terms of the enterprise side of things. And there's been a lot of efforts on private networking. So, private networks have been around for a while and have been gaining momentum predominantly with 4G or LTE. And that's been gaining momentum still within that realm. But then moving into 5G as well, a lot of interest in that. And what we see here, some data that we have from a recent study of over 5,000 enterprises is, there is interest in enterprise LTE and 5G, whether it's from as a service or privately, a solid percentage and growing of the budget they have for networking is sort of set aside for thinking about spending in this way, which is interesting to see. Next slide, please. I'll wrap up by talking about Edge, the other big hot thing that everyone's focused on. And again, a lot of developments. The big thing with Edge computing, there's lots of different types of solutions involved to make this happen, and lots of different edges, if you will. So there's a massive ecosystem diversity. Lots of different players, from your hyperscale cloud providers to your network owning operators to your compute providers to multiple types of software companies, integrators, et cetera. So that's all taking shape, and we're starting to see some models emerge with some consistency. What are the consumption models? Who you buy it from? How do you buy it? And there's an emphasis here on as a service models here that are developing. Really, what we've observed is enterprises are still pondering about what to do here. Well, how will it help them? What do they do? And of course, their supplier partners are more than happy to help them think about that, and that's ongoing as well. The key thing here is that the market is looking for early successes, actual implementations that have really made a difference in automation or in real-time, business activity, et cetera. And that will, of course, drive a lot in terms of confidence and encouragement. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we're going to move into the roundtable discussion. There's lots of ground to cover, and we should get straight to it. So what I'd like to do is ask each of the panel members to quickly introduce themselves so people know who's doing the talking, and then we'll move into some questions to get things rolling. So Mikael, we'll start with you. Could you please, quick introduction?
So Michael Bäck, I'm corporate officer in Ericsson. I've been here for 31 years now, I think, living through the 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G activities. So very much following this development.
Great, thanks. And Saratendu, Sethi, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, Jerry. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's a pleasure to meet you all virtually. I'm Saratendu Sethi. I'm a Vice President of AI at GP Worldwide, a company that specializes in providing procurement and supply chain solutions across the world.
Great, thanks. Terence, would you mind introducing yourself to the attendees?
Of course. Terence McCabe. I'm responsible for strategy and technology for Nokia in Asia Pacific and Japan. spending my time talking to our customers, both customer service or communication service providers and enterprises, about their future direction, carrying their voice back into the Nokia organization. So lots of good conversations in the space.
Great. And Shamik, over to you.
Greetings, everyone. Shamik Basu, I head up the Internet of Things business within Verizon's business group. And in my role, me and my team, we're constantly looking to leverage the assets that are provided to us, through the many currencies of 5G, and then, the network assets that we have, the platform partnerships, and really converting them into core business value propositions that we can take to customers. So that's the focus of my team. I'm eagerly looking forward to this discussion.
Great, thanks, Shamik. And Stephen, finally.
Thanks, Jerry. My name is Stephen Spellicy. I lead marketing within the telco cloud business at VMware, part of the service provider and edge business unit. Our products and services are focused completely on communication service providers. Specifically, we're providing telco cloud infrastructure for core and RAN, and now with edge. All of the experience around that, in addition to automation, observability, and AI, enabling CSPs to be more successful with their investments.
Great, thanks. All right, well, let's get into it. I think the first section we're going to focus on sort of level setting. Where are we now? What's really possible? What are enterprises out there looking at doing now? And we at GlobalData, myself personally, have had great pleasure working with a number of these companies on these panels. So I know there's a lot of activity going on firsthand. But I want to start with Shamik and get the service provider perspective. So we've heard about capabilities, what 5G, but also edge computing will be able to enable. But how do these actually manifest themselves in logical, practical enterprise use cases? And obviously the important follow-on there is business value creation for those enterprises. If you could comment on that to start things off, that would be great.
Yeah, sure, Jerry. And I think at the outset, it's important to kind of ground ourselves on, what those currencies are. You talked about those capabilities, and I think, no matter how you look at it, I think the discussions typically get seeded, very academically. One being the first currency being massive IoT. We're going to see many more sensors, in any sector of the cellular network. The second element is, you're going to see much greater levels of latency, that the network can afford. And the third and the more obvious one, I guess, is, you're going to get extremely high levels of throughput delivered to your devices and to through the network. And this is primarily a discussion that's been rooted in a lot of the theory around 5G and the core currencies around that. But I think it's important for us to understand how this translates into core business value, because at the end of the day, customers write checks when they can at least take most of these assets and convert them into operational outcomes. So what we're finding out is 5G for us today is very largely a bridging strategy, where customers are taking the technologies that we had through carrier aggregation, through dynamic spectrum sharing, evolving into our core 5G deployments nationwide, taking that very large gamut of sensors and bridging into the core currencies of 5G. So rapidly sensorizing their environments and really scaling that up, connecting that, and we like to call this little data to big data. So if you think about the convergence that's happening, you've got data coming from sensor, being fed over cellular networks into large hyperscaler environments. You've got, software as a service AI capabilities running on top of them and running business value. That is where customers are starting right now. But we can already see an evolution happening very quickly, and a lot of that is accelerated. And I'll give you a few examples. One is obviously pop-up locations, branch offices, customers want to take the advantage of fixed wireless access and see how they can find alternatives to broadband connectivity. That's the first one we're seeing. It's quite obvious. The second, and I'd say the third one as well, also accelerated things like crowd management. You're running into venues where you constantly have to determine if this venue is running out of capacity. Constant measurement of foot traffic in the building, that's one of them. Also accelerated by things like cashless retail, the ability to kind of use visual and camera to detect asset protection in retail locations. Those are the two other important ones that actually combine high throughput connectivity, edge processing, as well as the presence of the device itself. And then kind of veering off into some other enterprise scenarios, if you start to think about a large outcome in the US market, it's things like worker safety. So fast forward, if you think about functions that have traditionally required very intense human engagement, that moving over to robotics and automated guided vehicles and things like that, through the use of object recognition. Edge is a perfect use case for that, seeing some of that as well. And then finally, mixed reality. I think 5G is one of those things that really gets mixed reality off the ground through the combination of physical assets and being able to do the see what I see and management of those assets. And those are the four areas where we're starting to see immediate customer traction, to be honest with you. Starting out, as I said, with massive IoT, bridging right into the other currencies, starting with fixed wireless access, and then evolving into some of these other driven market accelerations that I just mentioned.
Okay, great. And again, I want to encourage other panel members to jump in on these questions too. But one of the things that we're seeing is there's amongst businesses generally across all the industries that we track is this intellectual appreciation of what could be possible, and now it's about making that leap from an appreciation at a sort of theoretical level to actually, okay, what's the ROI, and when and who should we work with? And Mikael, I'd like to ask you. I know Ericsson is engaged with customers around the world on this, through service providers and also perhaps directly as well. But what sort of deployments are you seeing, and are you seeing an acceleration in going from the theoretical to actually taking action?
Yeah, I think it's very clear. If you go back to when it all started in I guess around 2018, we had, of course, mobile broadband as the very key case for everyone. That was the scalable thing, and you would see the same in US, in Europe, in Korea. But now I think we have been experimenting since the early test systems 2015, 16 with industries from manufacturing to ports to automotive to transportation. So I see a lot of action over the scale, maybe with the exception of the extremely complex cases that requires a lot from the ecosystem that will take a bit longer time. But there is clearly a huge interest in all the things that we heard from Verizon. We see a lot of interest, of course, in private networks, in anything from manufacturing plants to ports to remote locations for mines and things like that. So that's a key thing that is happening. And I think, to me, that's another version of what we're trying to do with network slicing, to provide something that is seen by the end user as their own network instead of building it yourself. So I think that whole aspect of providing control to the end user being an enterprise is quite extreme. But we see a lot of things happening, of course, also in the what I would call simpler areas from either simpler ecosystem or that they are seen from before. So advancing everything you see around the smartphones on gaming, private users, and so on. Fixed wireless is another case that is well known. I think the whole area of logistics and so on have a 10+ year history of using this. So they are also very early out, while manufacturing is happening to some parts, but other parts requires a lot from the ecosystem. So we see quite a lot of experimentation that continues to happen, but the first case is clearly coming live, and we start to see real customer revenues coming in, not only CSP revenues, but also end user savings and efficiency and so on. So I think this is the start of a journey that will be as big as we would ever see the smartphone revolution in 4G. It's still early days, but there is quite a lot of things we can actually see now happening. And I think especially in North America, Northeast Asia, and then a bit more scattered over Europe and so on.
Yeah, our observations are that exactly, that the momentum, it definitely varies by region, depending on where things are. But as more examples and use cases and successes are happen, we can probably expect to see momentum more universally. So before we move away from this where are we now, what's really possible type the question is, does anybody else want to chime in before we move to the next phase of the discussion?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
just to play off of a theme that Mikael is mentioning, that this massive sort of increase in device count, the use cases in manufacturing are unavoidable. You have greater amount of sensors, but also in the industrial IoT at large, and things like smart meters, infrastructure. Just a huge amount of actual device density, which is really pushing operators to look for that next network. That next network is 5G. So the modernization of that 5G infrastructure is really key to the customers we're working with today, so they can actually go out and deliver on the promise of these advanced use cases.
Yeah. Great.
I think I would have to agree with Michael's point on the connectedness between the private LTE case as, if you like, the introductory experience for a lot of enterprises to what is possible and what the value is, and the ultimate destination of a hybrid environment where edge computing and slicing comes together with 5G to create virtualized private networks hybrid with the enterprise's own infrastructure itself. And the applications can actually migrate across that developing ecosystem. So often starting from a private network gives the enterprise or the non-traditional ecosystem player an opportunity to develop capabilities and experience and have those first experiences without having to have the perhaps nationwide coverage footprint or universal availability of 5G technology or edge compute.
Great point. Okay, excellent. So let's move to the next phase, which is more about short-term developments. I'm going to stay with you, Terence. Actually, we discussed this yesterday when we had a chat, but and I think you touched on it a bit there. But there is a question regarding the technology's readiness to support, Industry 4.0, and clearly, coming from a company like Nokia and other companies out there, there's a great belief in the power of the technology and that it works well today, and you're seeing it work with your customers. But there also is this notion, well, are the standards really set? What is this 5G advance that's coming from the 3GPP? Is that essential? Should we just wait? What about standalone versus non-standalone? Can you provide your thoughts about where we actually are on the journey?
Yes, and I do think it's an interesting point, and it goes back to what I've just been talking about on private versus public networks. When you're building out a nationwide network, there's a lag between the first site brought online and when you have a coverage footprint that will support, it'll be in-building use cases and the scale of deployment that may be necessary to support reliable service for these applications. Starting from the other end of the scale, private networks give you a more controlled environment that can be dedicated to specific use cases and can iterate through the standards more quickly. We do have today a combination of carrier customers and private customers who've rolled out 5G standalone. And there will be early adopters for, the ultra reliable, low latency use cases as we move forward. But for right now, I would say that, standalone is table stakes for those who are interested in a lot of the higher end low latency use cases for 5G. But many of the cases that we hear talked about and many of the cases that we're looking at don't actually require that ubiquitous low latency service, and can be built using the non-standalone networks that are more generally available today. And there is a stepping stone progression in the use cases. So there are lots of things to keep the ecosystem fully occupied today in building new devices, building new services. But there are things coming within the next 2 to 3 years, which will enable a whole new range of use cases. And perfect example, recently we have been working on some research in Australia, where we're looking at how you can remove the intelligence from a robot, make the robot, if you like, less autonomous, have a edge cloud where the intelligence, the image processing is handled, and have ultra low latency connectivity to a dumbed down robot, because that device will be cheaper, that device will have longer battery life, and will be more readily deployable in, let's say, a warehouse environment. Now, that needs to be proven, and the network that it's operating over needs to be ultra reliable. But those are the challenges that we're working to address right now. The technology exists to do that, but getting it refined and tuned to roll out at a mass scale. It's a lot easier to do that with private networks today than it is to use your general purpose sliced 5G network that's serving the whole range of use cases. We will get there, but by starting with private networks, you give yourself the opportunity to build new use cases without having to transform entire networks to do so.
Great. Shamik or Mikael, any follow-up comments on the sort of preparedness of the technology and the evolution in the sort of short to midterm?
Yeah, Jerry, so the one thing at least I can comment about is sort of a first-hand scenario and example that we have in the marketplace right now. And, for those that have followed the news, Verizon actually did an adjacent network deployment with the associated British ports in Europe. And it's a market where we actually don't own any public networks on the wireless side. And yet what we were able to do is we were able to create that single management layer for the customers that allowed us to kind of provide a service to them purely using a private network in a market that's adjacent to us. So the operative word here is what you'll see coming more and more is the discussion shifting to the managed layer in a very accelerated fashion. So it's not just about who's actually providing connectivity on a private basis in a certain market, but how are they streamlining the experience for the customer for them to get access to devices, the platforms that actually manage the network, and how can they actually manage multiple sites that the customers have with multiple private networks running on every single one of them. And we were able to do that with the associated British ports, where we actually don't have an operator RAN, but we actually support the entire management layer. So I think it's important to think about the management element of this along with networks, because it will become very relevant to when you combine the multiple currencies, including how you open doors with private networking, which lets customers kind of step up to edge compute use cases.
Great. Stephen, we've had a good focus in this section on private networks and how they might interplay with public networks. But from your work with in VMware, what's your view on how service providers can advance their private networking offers in the market? What do they need to be doing to take the best advantage of this opportunity that's emerging?
Well, I think private networking in general is the first real 5G footprint that many enterprises will experience. Much to Shamik's explanation, I think it starts with private networking and it moves to edge computing use cases. But to make that first plant, if you will, of 5G connectivity for in-building access, for more advanced use cases around things like manufacturing or healthcare and campuses in order to do smart medicine, anything smart is going to require an additional network. Of course, 4G provides quite a bit of capability for some of the more basic, if you will, services. But as bandwidth and latency become constrained, 5G will be the go-to network. What we're seeing with operators is those operators who are embracing a strategy of, if you will, landing and expanding their footprint with private 5G, helping those customers in specific industries, getting very, very fine-tuned on their pursuits related to industry verticals and use cases, a point that Terence made as well, which is start with a use case and then start to iterate beyond that. It's not a boil the ocean scenario. Private 5G isn't for everyone, and also network equipment vendors and ISVs who are working in this space are instrumenting their stacks for specific use cases in most cases. They're not necessarily just supporting all use cases. So depending on the vertical we're talking about, like smart manufacturer or smart medicine or healthcare, there are going to be certain use cases that are going to be more appropriate. For instance, in the mining and exploration verticals, things like automated guided vehicles, which require a very low latency communication in order to control those devices. In other industries like manufacturing, you're going to require maybe more bandwidth, but you can get away with higher amounts of latency, where EMBB is more appropriate, if you will. So something like operational surveillance or computer vision, enabling, if you will, remote operators to be able to see what's going on the shop floor in a manufacturing environment. The operator has the opportunity here, the CSP has the opportunity to help bring those use cases and capabilities to the customer. In other words, give them the art of the possible. But it starts with connectivity, and in and around that, the expansion play is letting them understand what they can do with the connectivity. Connectivity, for all intents and purposes, is a loss leader. You're talking about a few percentage points of profit increase from a connectivity as a service play. It's really the value add on top of that comes with edge application, orchestration, managed services, and lifecycle management of the infrastructure. That's where the opportunity is really going to be in the future, at least for the customers that we're working with today.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Before we move on, any other panel members want to comment on this? What are the key developments that we expect to see in the short to midterm and coming soon? Any other thoughts to throw in?
I will say one more on this point.
Yep.
The massive disaggregation that's happening in the RAN is highly disruptive. It's also creating new opportunity for increasing access. So as we talk about the proliferation of 5G in order to serve new use cases for new verticals and businesses all over the world, really increasing the access footprint is really key in order to carry the signal, deliver it to those businesses, and to be able to, if you will, be able to extend that capability to those who really need it. Whether we're talking about the context of delivering connectivity to bridge the digital divide or delivering services to businesses for, again, more advanced use cases that we've been discussing. So I think the disaggregation of the RAN is a really important piece of that, which is happening, and Open RAN is being highly disruptive in the industry. The other is this great dispersion that's happening of the users, but beyond that, right? Factories are operating autonomously. They require higher levels of intelligence and autonomy. They do require dedicated network connectivity that's reliable, that can deliver service levels that are commensurate of the kinds of tasks that those factories and businesses need to do. So SLA management is very important. Observability is important. And overall automation, driving, if you will, that autonomous experience is going to be very important. So my belief is that the higher you move up stack as it relates to these things that are happening, that our operators are going to gain greater value as they serve those customers, the enterprise as well as consumer mobile.
Great.
I think just a small comment on what I see talking to a number of the possible users here is that it's not only the peak rate, but I think also as soon as you can provide a predictable connection that is secure, that has a certain speed and a certain latency and so on, then it can really change the way people dare to use that network. So if you I've talked to a gaming developer, for example, talking about this, the way that gaming is downloading a lot of things in advance and so on. If you can really trust the network, you get away from all this kind of download. You can run streaming, you can present the same experience to all gamers instead of having to do all of these adaptations for people with bad environments. If you look at the use of Edge for offloading devices where you want to gain weight and battery and size like AR glasses, but even cars and so on, if they can rely on a network that is always there, you can offload to the roadside, you can offload to the, you can really get away from battery and a lot of power hungry things in the device. So I think the whole predictability of performance, not always the peak performance, but the kind of predictable average performance will lead to that many industries will dare to use the network for completely changing their industries fairly quickly. This is not so far away in time.
I would add just to Mikael's point on gaming, that this is a segment of at least consumer mobile that is gaining traction and actually highly monetizable. The advent of network slicing will enable those who purchase those slices, those secure and high performance slices, to have an edge on other gamers. And we're not talking about anymore kids sitting in their bedrooms playing video games. We're talking about esports, where there's actually money on the line. And if you have a few clicks and lower latency and your clicks are faster, and you can win in that game, you can win that prize in that tournament. That's a major development that's happened within the last few years, in which 5G is providing the infrastructure to enable those kinds of players who are competing in these tournaments to actually turn a profit.
Yeah, great point. Before we leave, I move on to the next discussion, and we're going to hear from Saratendu then as well. But Terence, I just want to know, the Openrun concept was thrown in there by Stephen. Do you have any perspective on how critical or not that is to advancing the capabilities that we're discussing? If you want to defer and don't want to, that's fine. But I thought I'd give it a shot since before we move on. Yeah.
No, Openrun is playing an important role. It's getting people thinking about how a RAN can be constructed, and there's more to Openrun than just opening up the interface between the radio and the baseband unit. A lot of people have come to associate the cloudification of the RAN with Openrun, and so you're seeing virtualized or cloudified baseband development, and the potentially the disaggregation of who actually provides the components and who manages those components. We're seeing the new players in the business, if you like, as the towercos in some countries are starting to look at hosting some of the active components, and Openrun can play a role in moving the architecture forward and moving thinking forward in that regard. I just think that the reality is today that it's still early days, and we're working on the standards. We've been part of working on those standards, and I think that the industry as a whole will benefit from this, but it's going to take some time to get the sort of open interoperability that people hope for and expect.
Yeah, great points. Great points. Okay, well, let's move into the last stage, which is to think about the future. I want to throw it over to Saratendu. So there's a number of different processes and industries that will be, we expect, dramatically impacted by what 5G will enable and edge computing will enable. But how can you describe? Let's focus on one super important one, which is the supply chain. Describe or talk about how 5G will impact supply chain, some of the business and technology barriers that might be encountered.
Sure, Jerry. So one thing I have to say that the wonderful technology that my colleagues have just presented, I happen to be on the consumer side of things, building those initial use cases, taking those technologies to our customers to solve specifically supply chain problems. So to begin with, supply chain is really, it has, even before the supply chain has been undergoing a whole digitalization, and this is very common across the entire industry. So at the core of a digital supply chain, what's important is data and end-to-end electronic connectivity. And this is where actually the 5G comes in. The promises of 5G about accelerated data speeds, reduced latency, ability to connect significantly more devices to enable IoT, means all these promises are phenomenal, and this is exactly what we are trying to work with our customers to build use cases. Examples, to quote a few examples of use cases that we are directly working with our customers. Using IoT to enable just-in-time manufacturing by tracking parts in real time as they are moving from the assembly line, rather than waiting for a scheduled arrival and do a lot of scheduling. So in fact, we are building opportunities by the save time to keep these manufacturing processes running throughout. And this is, I refer to manufacturing, but you can think of supply chain is basically, this is a supply chain problem. 5G, when you continuing on that idea, means 5G allows you that now that we can connect more and more devices, we can actually track goods as they're being manufactured and moving across warehouse distribution centers at a SKU level. And again, like these are in very early stages, like some of the previous panelists have spoken about. But this is an area where there's a lot of interest riding at the moment. We are seeing a lot of move across automation in transportation through autonomous vehicles, automated delivery, rerouting optimally, which is once we have seen the disruptions with situations like Suez Canal or different forest fires, so things have to be rerouted, and that optimal rerouting, on-the-fly rerouting is important, which we believe that 5G will strongly enable, given with the low latency promise. We are also seeing working with some large vendors, and where basically the use case is how we can leverage 5G to move between back and forth between indoor and outdoor environments, moving from mobile communications setups to indoor like Wi-Fi, so that when the goods are moving inside, the goods are traveling between cities and then they're moving inside the warehouse, we can continue to track in real time how those things are traveling. This is not a use case of future. In fact, we see some of these large scale implementations already happening, like in Port of Barcelona, when container ships are pulling in. Already there's technology that can communicate and give a full idea of what that ship is carrying, and every single container contents within it. So as a 5G becomes more and more prevalent, the infrastructure gets built, these use cases will become more and more real. Because today we are speaking of one-off implementations here and there. And of course, when you think of like all this is working to the dot, then basically I would say digital supply chain is really becoming about agile supply chain management.
Yes, absolutely. Excellent. That's fantastic insight. Much appreciated. Just in terms of the future, you brought up a couple of really good points in there about who the suppliers are going to be and where they are in terms of their connections with your customers and the solutions you're building. And I just want to do quickly one last roundup comment from all of you on the panel. And we only have a few minutes, so if you just keep it to about a minute, but your top level thought on these issues we've been discussing, or your top level expectation, however you want to address it. But let's start first with Mikael, Bäck, if you could give a quick summation from your perspective.
I think what we see now is clearly the beginning of something enormously important, and it will take some time in some parts, while others are happening early, as we see now from Verizon and others. I think it's the whole journey now from 5G to 6G will take us on the route for, I think the 5G system, the digital systems will be the enabler of many things on society, anything from carbon dioxide reductions to automation, saving money in many different industries, but also I think it will have a very wide use going forward. And then 6G will complement that with more extreme experiences, being immersive, being the internet of senses and other things we haven't really thought about yet. So I think, to me, this is in the end going to be bigger than the evolution of the whole app ecosystem and so on we saw for 4G. But I think in some areas we have underestimated the time it takes due to the enormously complex ecosystem around some of the more especially advanced use cases. So I think, to me, this is going to be an extreme journey, but the timing will in some areas be a bit slower than we thought a couple of years ago.
Yeah, excellent point there. Excellent point. Thank you. Saratendu, any final quick comment?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll definitely second what Mikael just said, because it's an extreme journey and we are still in the initial phases. And having said that, 5G, IoT, edge computing, these are actually very crucial technologies for supply chain. But we have to think of the entire ecosystem and complementary capabilities and how the vendors' ecosystem kind of stabilizes, because we also have to think about what it takes to come up with open standards. Means if there is a higher proliferation of private networks, what's the implication for like openness, which is very crucial for software vendors like GP. But at the same time, from our customers' perspective, if all these things take a long time to be figured out, then that will eventually push out some of these art of the possible use cases that we are talking about right now. And all we will be left with in 5G is just taking advantage of the increased bandwidth and increased connectivity. And that something will be a same in my opinion, in my personal opinion, because the most exciting aspect of 5G and edge computing is basically going after those new use cases, not just making making existing use cases faster and more reliable is important, but we also have to look at the next generation of supply chain.
Great, thanks very much. Terence, final quick comment.
I think great points made to date. I do think that there's an important and complementary role between CSP networks and private networks, just as there is a very important role to be played by the hyperscalers in the creation of globally consistent consumer use cases. But the truth here is that there is no single application, there is no single direction that this industry will take. We will see a diversity of different approaches and industries that all leverage a common set of standards for network connectivity, because that gives us economies of scale in devices. It gives us economies of scale in rolling things out. But that diversity is something that we're not traditionally used to in the telecom space. So there's quite a lot of learning to do in developing the ecosystem so that we cooperate and don't trip over each other.
Great, thanks. Shamik, final thought from you?
Yeah, I would only say that, as we start thinking about 5G, think about 5G is not another 4G. 5G is actually a quantum leap, in terms of, the amount of devices that will be in a square kilometer or any of the other parameters that we talked about measuring. And the other thing I would also emphasize is if you're someone that's looking to realize outcomes via 5G, it's critically important that you start looking at your entire solution stack and start identifying who the right partners are going to be in each part of the stack. Because traditionally, it is not something that people have looked at with much diligence because they've looked at an operator differently and a hyperscaler differently and a solution provider differently. I think this is an opportunity where you really have to start looking at, who are the best solutions providers in each layer of the stack and make those choices and decisions just to make sure, I wouldn't even call it the ecosystem. I would even say the stacked solution kind of comes together, because if you're looking for more turnkey, that's an investment that people have to start making right now as to how they put the power of 5G into realizing those business outcomes. We talked about network, we talked about software-defined networks, we talked about hyperscale, we talked about the specific service providers, let's say in an area like automotive, that are bringing solution to market. Then we're talking about the system integrators that are sitting on top of that are pulling it all together. So I think realizing, the players in each part of the stack and how advanced they've been in bringing 5G solutions, or at least envisioning 5G solutions, is going to be critically important for anyone that's trying to put the power of 5G into a solution.
Yeah, great point. Okay, and finally, Stephen.
Jerry, I'd say Edge is not the final frontier, it's the next frontier. And I think that CSPs need to recognize this very quickly, that this is the opportunity they've been waiting for in order to monetize and deliver new services and capabilities to their customers. Terence mentioned a little bit a little while ago about the last mile sort of syndrome, the issue of connectivity and sort of the gap between the enterprise and that point. I think it's not a last mile issue, it's the last quarter mile issue. And I think as we collapse and increase the bandwidth and capability of the network, the distance between the 2 points are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we need to have resources closer and closer to where the action is. And to Saratendu's point, when you think about what are we delivering, the network is a table stake. It's really what we do on top of that to achieve business outcomes, which is going to be far greater in value for our enterprise customers and ultimately for our own businesses. I'd say also the last thing that CSPs need to really think about as they look at the 5G and IoT opportunities in the future is have a solutions mindset. Really think through the partner ecosystem. And to echo Shamik's point, you really need to think through, what do you want to build and bring to market that will drive the greatest value for the next generation of use cases and opportunities for your business.
Yeah. Okay. Super wrap up. Thank you very much. Yeah. Really, I just want to say thank you to the panel. Me and the team at GlobalData study these activities very, very closely, but I definitely learned a lot today from hearing your thoughts on your your observations of dealing out there in the real world. So very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience as well.